Hello everyone, welcome to Cukmekerb's coding class. So, let's say you are working on a new web app, and you need to access an API that for whatever reason does not allow cross-origin resource sharing. One of those examples might be the News API, which I made a video on a while back, and since I made that video, they actually decided to make it so that that API would not work from the client side because they turned off CORS. And I was recently working on a project that is kind of a client, an unofficial client for something, and it also was blocking CORS requests, which is very reasonable because they probably want security, and disabling CORS is good for security. But you still want to access these APIs, so you would make a CORS proxy. And one such CORS proxy is called CORS Anywhere. This is their website, and here is their GitHub repository. And basically, they make it fairly easy for you to set up your own server that runs this CORS proxy. But here's the problem. You gotta deal with having a whole Node.js server constantly running, so you'd have to get it hosted and stuff, and that's pretty complicated. And well, it isn't necessarily complicated, but it's certainly inconvenient. So Netlify Functions are a better way you can do this if you are doing a front-end web project. It's actually very easy to make a CORS proxy with Netlify Functions, and the nice thing about it is that it doesn't have to run constantly, you don't have to deal with Node.js, and it's free for up to 125,000 requests per month, and then you got to pay for it. But 125,000 requests a month is very reasonable. I mean, that's a lot of requests. So I think Netlify Functions are a very good way to make yourself a little CORS proxy. So first things first, let's set up this Netlify project. You might already have yours set up, but here's the things that are required to have this thing set up. So first, make a file called netlify.toml, and then here you want your functions directory to be set, so functions equals, and in quotes, netlify_functions, or whatever you want to call your folder. I want to call it netlify_functions. Now we can make a new folder and call it netlify_functions. And then we can start working on our function. It's that easy to get set up. So our function has one dependency, and that is node fetch. Technically, you can use Axios or whatever Node.js request library you prefer, but I like node fetch because it's basically just a clone of the web fetch API, and the web fetch API is really nice to work with. So we need to install that. Luckily, that's very easy. You can do this with either Yarn or NPM or whatever Node.js package manager you'd want to use, but I'm just going to do yarn add node fetch. Wait a second, and it's done. That was easy. Now, let's actually get to the good stuff. Var fetch equals require, in parentheses, node-fetch, and then I'm going to save this as /netlify functions/cors.js. You can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it cors.js. That's a nice name. Now, we can do exports.handler equals async, in parentheses, event, comma, context. Now, async, whoops, I did not mean to do that. Wrong button. Async is relevant because if you remove this async, you could still use Netlify functions, but you have to use a callback function, and that's the old way of doing things. Async is much better. It's just nicer to write. So make this an arrow function, and then ignore these lines here. This is for a plugin I'm working on for LightXL that is completely unfinished, and therefore it doesn't work right, but it's going to end up mimicking the way VS Code highlights changed lines, but it doesn't work right now. So you're going to see a lot of green and blue on the left, even though those are probably not the right colors for this anyway. So first thing, we're going to do is var URL equals event.path. Now, this is the URL that the function was called from, so it will be the entire URL that was requested from, the client or whatever. So we need to extract from that the URL we want to fetch. And the easiest way to do this is to separate it with a slash, the same way that CORS anywhere does. So you do fetch, the URL of the function plus a slash, and then the URL that you actually want to get. That's the very simple interface. So that's what I'm going to mimic. So URL equals URL.split, and then in quotes here, .netlify/functions/CORS. And if you named this something other than CORS.js, you would change this to whatever your file name is. But in my case, it's CORS. So that's what you would do. And then here you just do square brackets 1. So that means that it will grab everything after .netlify/functions/CORS. Oh, slash at the end. So this basically what it'll do is it'll grab the URL that you requested. Then we can do URL equals decode URI component URL. You don't technically have to do this depending on how you want this set up, but generally it's best to do this step so that if it does happen to get sent as an encoded URI component, the whole thing doesn't crash and it'll just work. Then we do URL equals new URL in parentheses URL. And that just converts it into a JavaScript URL object, which is useful. Now we can do for var I in, actually, this is bad practice. We should not use var for loops. You should use let. Pro tip right there. Let I in event dot query string parameters. And these are obviously the query string parameters. And the reason we need to deal with this is because even though we got this URL here, this does not include the query string parameters. So we need to add these back onto the URL. So we just do URL dot search params with a capital P dot append in parentheses I, comma, event dot query string parameters, square brackets I. So this just will loop through all of the query string parameters and stick them back onto the end of the URL. Now, if you want to send cookies, which for the project I was doing, I definitely did want to send cookies to my, endpoint. So what we have to do is var cookie underscore string equals event dot headers dot cookie, or just quotes. That way it won't error out if it's null. Then we do var user agent equals event dot headers dot, we can't use dot, we have to use this notation, user dash agent, because it's got a dash in it, so you have to use whatever this notation is called. I forgot the name of it. And then we also just do or blank. Now, you might have some other custom headers that you want to send, and technically, if you wanted, you could loop through the headers and have it append every single header, but generally, that isn't required. So I'm only doing these two headers because these are what's usually relevant, but technically, you could have it send every single header from this. And in my use case, actually, there was one other header that I needed to send every single time, which was called the request verification token. So you can just basically just copy this and do it again. Now we can do var headers underscore to underscore send equals and a new object. And then we do cookie colon cookie string. Then we can do user dash agent, and then any other headers you might want to specify. I'm going to do content dash type colon application /JSON. Of course, if you're sending some other type of data, you could change this, or you can have it set to the header. I'm doing this the manual way because I don't want to bother with every single header being identical. It just doesn't really matter. Then we can do accept :***, so it'll take anything. And then finally, host :URL.host. Now we can do var options equals method :event dot http method with a capital M dot to uppercase. I think the case might not actually matter, but just in case, just do uppercase. Headers :headers to send, and finally body :event dot body. Now this method here, we want it to be the same as whatever method we got. So if we send a GET request, we're forwarding that as a GET request. Send a POST, forwarding as a POST. And this body here can actually cause errors if you try and send it with a GET request. So we are going to be removing it in a second if it isn't a GET request. So if event.http method is equal to get, or event.http method is equal to head. Oh, and we should convert these into uppercase .to uppercase. And we could also .to uppercase. We will delete options .body. So now if it's a GET request or a head request, we delete options.body. If it's post or put or delete or any of that, you do not delete the body. Now we have to actually fetch the stuff. So var response equals await fetch URL options. And the nice thing about having this be an asynchronous function here is that you can use await and you don't have to use .thens and all that. Next, we do var response underscore text equals await response dot text, open parentheses, it's just a function. Now you might notice that this will only work if the server returns text, and that is true, and in a bit I will explain how to get around that. Now we do var headers equals response dot headers dot raw. And what raw does is it converts it into a regular JavaScript object rather than a headers object, which will be useful in a second. We do var cookie header, and this is only relevant if your endpoint is going to be setting cookies, equals null, and we just do if headers set dash cookie, we're using this notation again, is not null, and I think we don't actually have to do with is not null. If headers set cookie underscore header equals headers set dash cookie. So now if the header exists, we're setting this value to it, and otherwise nothing happens. Now finally we can return status code :200. Now of course if you want to forward the status code you would have to do that as well, but I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to do 200 for everything, which I know is kind of cursed, but you can figure it out. Body response text. Now we can do headers, then we just do content dash type string headers set dash cookie, or text slash plain. So if there's no MIME type just default to plain text. Next, we do multi-value headers, because for some reason it's not supported inside the same object, so you have to do two separate objects. Kind of weird, but we just do set-cookie colon cookie header or empty array. And that is about it. Now, I will get to being able to return files that are not text, but first, let us run netlify dev, which, if all goes well, I think it did. Yep, this is perfect. So we'll do /.netlify /functions /CORS /https://duckduckgo.com. Uh-oh. There were a few bugs that were just caused by typos. I already fixed all those. And one last thing, this content type thing, I don't know why I put the header as set cookie. You should definitely change that to content-type. Otherwise, you'll just end up with a plain text mess. Now, if I fetch this random Mapbox endpoint I was doing some tests on, you will see that it works. However, if we try and fetch, say, an image, duckduckgo.com/favicon.ico, this image right here, if we put this into our proxy, we will see we have a problem. This is not an image. That's not what an image looks like. And the reason for that is, of course, that we did response.text. Now, there are a few ways that we could get around this, and all of them involve encoding it into base 64. See, one of the limitations of Netlify Functions is that you have two ways of returning files, either plain text or encoded into base 64. Now, what you could do is go through and find some way of going through every single MIME type and checking if it's plain text or not, but I couldn't find like a Node.js library that could do that. I looked at the MIME type library, and it doesn't really have a way to check if a MIME type is plain text or binary. So, your other option is to send every single response as base 64, but the problem with this, of course, is that then you waste a whole bunch of bandwidth on responses that don't need to be encoded into base 64, like plain text files. They're just bigger for no reason, and that decreases page load speed. So, obviously, that's bad. However, there's another thing you could do, and I guess it's kind of a dumb workaround, and you could do it the way I suggested a second ago if you wanted, but you could just make another proxy and have that one return everything as base 64. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how to do that. You could, of course, use some if statements and figure it out on your own. I'm going to make a new file, paste everything into it. I'm going to save this as Netlify Functions /CORS-binary.js. Now we have to change this from CORS to CORS-binary. Then down here, we have to do little changes. So instead of doing response_text like this, we're going to do response_buffer. We're going to have this thing be returned to us as an array buffer. I'm going to change this to .arrayBuffer. Oh, .arrayBuffer, and the A is actually not capitalized. That was a mistake there. Next, we do var base 64 encoded equals response buffer dot toString base 64. And so this converts it into base 64. Now, for the return here, instead of this, we do base 64 underscore encoded, and we have to add one more parameter here, is base 64 encoded true. So now we're telling Netlify that this is base 64 encoded, and everything else should be the same. So now, if we go here, we change CORS to CORS-binary, we get an error. So yeah, response buffer, this should not be .array buffer, it should be .buffer. Even though I can't find that on the MDM docs. I have no idea how I came up with .buffer and not .array buffer, and I thought it was a mistake. But apparently, it was not a mistake. So yeah, don't do .array buffer, do .buffer. And that is how you send it. It'll work on any sort of file that is not text, and it will also work on anything that is text, like DuckDuckGo.com. Of course, I wouldn't recommend using it for anything that is text because, like I said, base64 wastes a bunch of bandwidth because base64 encoded is actually larger than the original string. So that's how you do that. And if you do figure out an easy way to do it based on the MIME type, please let me know because I'd love to make this simpler. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, the color of cheese.